Welcome to Speak Out. I'm Sandy Galef, a member of the New York State Assembly representing parts of Northern Westchester and parts of Putnam County. And today we're going to be talking about the dangers of e-cigarettes and vaping. And I have just some very special people with me to talk about this very important issue and the need for change. So first of all, I'd like to introduce Jack Waxman. And Jack, you're a senior at Scarsdale High School.
Yes.
Welcome. It's great to have you here.
Thank you so much. Thanks for having me.
Right. Well, I met Jack because he's been lobbying me in different places about the topic we're going to talk about. And then Michael Maitland, who is a senior at Horace Greeley High School.
Hi, how are you?
Welcome. It's good to have you here, and you're very involved in this issue too and trying to make changes.
Yes, thank you for having me.
Right. And Dr. Richard Stumacher, who is a pulmonologist at Northern Westchester Hospital, welcome. And we'll find out how you got involved. But let's talk. Let's start with Jack.
Of course.
Okay. So why are we here, Jack? What's the problem? How are you into it?
So the problem is that there's so many youth right now that are not just using e-cigarettes and Juuls, but are also addicted to them. You know, the problem started last year when I was a junior at Scarsdale High School, and my friends started to use these products, and they were kind of messing around with it. Like, oh, this is pretty cool. Fast forward to now, and you have almost half the population of my school or of my class addicted to these products, these e-cigarettes. You know, the flashy packaging, the exotic flavors, the high nicotine levels, and I see a problem, and I'm doing all I can to, fight with it. As an intern for Senator Schumer, I wrote my policy, intern paper on it, and from there it kind of just snowballed into something more serious. So, I've been meeting with legislators and making videos to show, the population just what the problem is and how we can, work together to make a solution and improve the problem.
Since I'm not in high school, I didn't realize that it was such a big problem. I didn't, you say more than half of the kids
it's
in
terrible.
Your school.
And it's with everyone, freshmen up to seniors, and then you go to the middle schools, it's a problem there too. Although there hasn't been, specific polls or, numbers that show kind of the percentages. Back in 2016, when e-cigarettes weren't even a big problem, the Campaign for Tobacco-Free Kids found that around 16% of seniors used it, up from 1.5% in 2011, and now it's in 2018. You can imagine those numbers are much higher.
Wow.
Yeah.
Huge
Yes.
epidemic, really. Michael, do you have you're at Horace Greeley, a different high school. Is it the same story?
So I think it's a little bit different. I think that at Greeley, it started off having your traditional vapes, and then 2 years ago, people started getting into Juul, and at Greeley, people do it because they think it's cool and they don't really think that it's bad for them. They kind of see it as like a fun social thing to do. I mean, you could walk into a bathroom and you're almost guaranteed to see somebody or a group of people juuling, and no one can really do anything about it because it's very easy to conceal and stuff. And overall, people just use it and don't see it as an issue.
Mm-hmm. You use the term juuling, and it's a Juul, right? But you're juuling when you're smoking it. Does it look like a regular e-cigarette?
So actually it looks a lot more discreet. It actually looks like a flash drive. And so actually in the library, kids have said, oh yeah, I'm just charging I put my flash drive into my computer, and the librarians and the teachers will have no idea because it's so discreet, and you can put it in your pocket, you could put it in your sock, you could hide it anywhere and really not get caught with it.
Wow.
Yeah.
So, Rich, how did you get involved in this issue?
So I work at Northern Westchester Hospital, and we have a President's Junior Leadership Council that Michael is on. And it's a group of high school students from the schools in our catchment area. And every year they meet and they discuss what health issue or topic they want to address and then bring back to their schools. And last year, they went to the CEO of our hospital, Joel Seligman, and said, vaping is really terrible, and we'd like your help in doing something about it. So the hospital looked to me because I do smoking cessation, and I've been doing it for, I think, 13, 14 years. And they said, Rich, what do you know about vaping? And I said, nothing. So it's time for me to learn. So I started to research, and I started to look through the articles and some of the research that's out there, and what I started to discover had me very, very concerned. I was invited by Nita Lowy to come to a special panel of school superintendents where I was able to kind of give some of the information that I had learned, and then Mary Fox Alter, who's the superintendent of Pleasantville, had asked me to come speak to their Pleasantville Strong, which is an organization against tobacco and alcohol and drug use in the town, because there was a vape shop opening up. And from that, it kind of snowballed, and I started doing a lot of parent presentations in our catchment center. But even more importantly, thanks to Michael and his colleagues, or his co-students, we kind of changed what we do from a community outreach at Northern Westchester. So we have a respiratory therapist who goes to the middle schools and usually gives a lecture on smoking and cigarettes.
And so you're talking about middle school, not even high school.
Right. So middle school, to their health classes, they go in, and they had been talking about smoking, but we know that none of these kids want to smoke. It's considered disgusting, and no one's really smoking, at least in Westchester at that age. Very, very few. But they're all vaping, and many of them start in middle school, believe it or not. So we completely changed the talk from 100% about smoking to about 25% about smoking and 75% about vaping. So we're now teaching the middle schoolers about the dangers of vaping, and to give them tools to be prepared how to say no when they're offered a Juul at a party, because we know it's going to happen. It's only a question of when, not if, at a party, that some older kid is going to offer a younger kid a mango flavored vape and say, take a hit of this. And then the younger kid is going to say, well, is there nicotine in it? And nobody even knows if there's nicotine, because they've heard the word nicotine. Some say yes, some say no, some say don't worry about it. They start vaping, and the next thing you know, they're very addicted.
Wow. So you're seniors, you go to parties, I'm sure. Is that true? Is that what happens? A lot of pressure?
I don't think that there's necessarily a lot of pressure if you don't want to do it, but there's definitely the option, and people there being like, oh, take a hit. And maybe they're not going to push you to just take it, but it's definitely like, hey, you want to rip, or the guy's next to you doing it, you kind of want to seem cool because you're a little bit younger. Like, it does happen that it's there if you want it, and there is a little bit of pressure to do it.
And can I jump in? The problem is the perception, and this is the key part, is that it's not harmful. So the overwhelming concept is that this is not harmful, it's safe, it's marketed towards the kids indirectly as a safe alternative to smoking. It's a way to have a form of intoxication. You get a little bit of a buzz when you take it, and it tastes really good, and no one thinks it's bad for you.
Yeah, and also it's the peer pressure, but it's also these products are genuinely, attractive to kids. They're marketing applesauce and cotton candy. Not only is there a sense of peer pressure.
Is that the name of
the flavors?
The
there
flavors.
are like
Okay.
thousands of different kinds of e-liquid flavors, and they appeal to youth specifically. S'mores and rocket blades and all that stuff. And I don't even think it's peer pressure. I just think like they genuinely want to try it, and that's geared on purpose because these companies can't create flavored cigarettes. Those were banned by the 2009 Tobacco Control Act. But right now there's a loophole with e-cigarettes, and these vape companies, I feel, are kind of exploiting that loophole and marketing their products exclusively to kids in a way that actually attracts them. I think it's working, and I think we have to do something to prevent that, because I think that's an emerging problem.
Is there a theory that if you use e-cigarettes or juuling that you'll go on maybe later on to cigarettes, you'll become addicted, or is it just a problem of what's in them right now that's a problem?
I think that the e-cigarette market is replacing the cigarette market for the youth. I think that there really isn't a lot of people who are going to go from juuling to cigarettes. I think that it's very much, I'm going to juul and there's nothing wrong with it. There's nothing bad. There's not going to be any side effects. So they're staying away from cigarettes, but they're just going to continue to juuling. That's the new mainstream thing, that just like when you guys were younger, it was, oh, cigarettes aren't bad for you, we're going to smoke them, they're cool. It's the same thing with juul now, just a different medium.
Yeah, but also there's a study that came out of the UPitt Health Sciences showing that an adolescent who vapes is actually 4 times more likely to begin using traditional tobacco cigarettes than their counterparts who don't vape. although that's a smaller chunk, it shows that there is kind of the idea of kind of a gateway drug.
Yeah.
Right.
So
And
I'm sorry, can I just address that for a second? So there's a lot of literature now about whether or not e-cigarette use in the youth leads to conventional cigarette use. And the latest studies show that it does, and of course people are going to try to refute it and kind of say, oh, maybe it isn't. The National Academy of Sciences and Medicine, of Engineering Sciences and Medicine, released their report in January of just this year. So was it the NIH or FDA, I forget which government body, had asked the National Academy to review all the literature. So they looked at over 800 peer-reviewed articles, and they released everything that they have to say of what we know now about the dangers of vaping. And they said that the evidence is substantial evidence that e-cigarette use leads to conventional cigarette use later on in adolescence and youth. The truth is nobody really knows exactly right now how much. The article that Jack is referring to, I heard numbers between 2 to 7 times more likely. So it doesn't mean you're automatically going to go on to smoking cigarettes. And there are people who have a very good, valid point that maybe these kids were going to go on to smoke cigarettes anyway, and you don't know that it became a gateway.
But looking at your statistics,
I think the bottom line is that these e-cigarettes are creating a generation of addicts addicted to nicotine. Whether they're using e-cigarettes or cigarettes, that's the idea, that these kids, these e-cigarettes are luring these kids in, and they're becoming ingratiated into this, nicotine addiction, which I see no end to in the foreseeable future. And I think that's the main part that these kids don't understand, is that nicotine, unlike say alcohol, like one whiff of it can addict you for a while, and it's not something to be tried, played around with. It's a serious drug, and if not one of the most addictive drugs in the world. I can't speak to just what numbers, but I've heard that up with heroin and cocaine, it's one of the most addictive drugs in the world.
But we've tried so hard, in my legislative career of trying to lower the smoking rates. And we were doing really well with our students. And then now, as you said, this is just pulling it up. Are the e-cigarettes even have more nicotine in it than a regular cigarette?
Yes. So the Juul, which is the most popular e-cigarette brand amongst youth, is 4 times more potent in nicotine than traditional cigarettes. They have around 5% nicotine by volume, while traditional cigarettes have around 1.23% nicotine by weight. So the addictiveness is just off the charts.
So I also have older people who say, well, I'm using e-cigarettes to stop smoking. They're going in the other direction. And they email me and say, oh, don't ban e-cigarettes, because I've been using that to get off of the smoking habit that I have. So actually, that's not quite true then, from what you're saying, is that with all that nicotine, it's not really helping them it's just a different vehicle.
I think it's just transferring them from one nicotine device to another nicotine device. And to speak to the idea of banning it, I don't think anyone's advocating for a full-out ban on e-cigarettes. I just think there's a lot on e-cigarettes, I just think there's a lot of support for the idea that you want to extend the Tobacco Control Act of regulating the flavors to include e-cigarettes, but I don't think the idea of a full-out ban on e-cigarettes is being discussed.
I just want to address some of that. The literature on whether or not vaping devices or electronic cigarettes is a useful form of smoking cessation is very equivocal. So there's a lot of good literature that says it's definitely helpful, and there's a lot of literature that says that it doesn't help at all. So we really don't know. And that doesn't mean that it can't. It means for some people it's going to work, and some people it's not going to work. Jack's point about nicotine addiction is really what my major point of when I talk to the parents of Westchester is about the business of nicotine addiction in our children. So let's talk about 2 separate issues. When you want to talk about an adult who already is smoking cigarettes and clearly wants to get off cigarettes, the first thing they should do is go through a smoking cessation program and go through the tried and true processes, which aren't that great, right? Because if they were great, everybody would quit smoking. Right. So if they fail those and they feel like they can't get off cigarettes and they want to vape, I think they should, because clearly there are harmful chemicals in vapes. That's clear in that study. There's just a lot less of them. And we don't know what's going to be till about 20 or 30 years from now. So from a concept of harm reduction, people like to throw that terminology around. I would say to my patients, if you can't get off your pack a day and you've tried everything else, absolutely you should vape. This is not what we're talking about.
Yeah,
What we're talking about is young
starting,
people.
Starting in.
And what we're talking about is a specifically intentional targeting of young children, middle school, with flavors so that they can enter into the nicotine addiction marketplace. So their brain development at that time, so part of the lecture that I give talks about the prefrontal cortex, which is the slowest part of the brain to develop. And it is also one of the areas of, that's involved in addiction. So nicotine, which is in my mind the most addictive substance known to mankind, is being introduced into young people at exactly the wrong time in their brain development, which makes them extremely more likely to become nicotine addicts. Now, again, I don't want anyone to be addicted to anything. However, we're still allowed to do things that aren't, that are harmful to us, right? As adults, we can partake in harmful activities and harmful food and ingest these things. But that's not what we're talking about. And, Michael and his colleagues really saw this as a problem at a time. It's very interesting that, including myself as a pulmonologist, was flying way below my radar and everyone else's radar. And to them, they think it's safe, and yet they still said, this is a problem.
I mean, that's what you've said. It just came up quickly as an option for young people.
Yep.
And so I guess that's where we were. Let's talk about the age issue too, because we're always talking in Albany about when do we allow people to buy cigarettes? When do we allow people to buy e-cigarettes? Do we have regulations in place? So you have a position that you're lobbying for, I believe, right?
Yeah, so I fully support Tobacco 21, both at the county and state levels. I think it's a great first step because it kind of increases, just puts up another barrier, because I hear stories from my friends that, their older brother or their friend who's maybe 19 years old can legally go to the store and, buy some pods or vapes and bring it back to them. So I think Tobacco 21 will be a great block there. But I think piggybacking off Tobacco 21, I think regulating the exotic flavors is also an amazing step, because like Dr. Stubmacher said, at 13 years old, these kids are very vulnerable to flashy flavors and, flashy marketing. So I think those two initiatives, Tobacco 21 and regulating the flavors, are super important in this fight towards curtailing teenage addiction to e-cigarettes.
So, Michael, are you also working on that?
Yes,
through the
I
hospital?
also support Tobacco 21. I think that it's a very good barrier, because the amount of people who are 18 or 19 who can go and buy tobacco at that age can go buy pods, and they're more inclined to sell to the younger kids because they're in closer proximity. Maybe they're in the same high school, maybe they have siblings that are close to that age. Once you kind of put that 21 age barrier, those people are maybe a little bit more mature, not hanging out with such a young crowd, that they might not be as inclined to start giving those younger children the tobacco products and get them hooked.
And that's a very important point that he says, is that there's a secondary market in these schools. And these kids are buying it and then reselling it for a profit. And just the charger device that plugs into the USB port in a computer is about that big. And these kids lose their $800 iPhones all the time. So you can imagine how quickly they're losing these tiny little devices, which go, how much do they sell for?
$12.
They sell for $12. So they find them loose, they find them on the bus. The other thing is that in buses where middle schoolers and high schoolers are getting on the same bus, if they're vaping on the bus or if things are falling down or around in the bus, then other kids can pick them up. So, as these guys have pointed out, and eloquently pointed out, that raising the age will kind of distance an adult from the child who might be enticed to try.
So what do we do about the schools? I mean, we passed legislation, you can't smoke in schools, right? But you've said it's happening. Different kind of smoke? I don't know, do we need to clarify what it means to smoke?
So Juuls and other vaping devices aren't actually real smoke, it's vapor. So one, it doesn't have a smell. So if you're smoking a cigarette in school, a teacher, an administrator, another student can easily smell a cigarette. A Juul, there's no smell. So it's very easy to go into the bathroom or sit in the back of your class and take a little puff and nobody will really know. And then on top of that, you have your flavors, so people can kind of pick them. They're also not as, you can blow big clouds, but you can also really have no smoke coming out at all. So it's very discreet in a way compared to cigarettes.
So it is illegal, right? It's part of the Clean Indoor Act.
Right.
But you can't police it because it's very hard to find the children in the act. And all these schools do, and when they do, they have their own policies and procedures of behavioral misconduct that they kind of go through, and they also try and educate the children, and they're also speaking to the parents. Sometimes the parents don't really know what's going on. I've been in some of these schools, I've had the principals tell me the parents show up angry and demand to have the Juul returned to them because it was $80 when they bought it, and they bought it for their kids, and they don't want to lose that money. So I think,
We have a lot of educating to do, don't we?
Yes, unfortunately.
So if people want to have that kind of education within the schools, I guess you have to have forums and that kind of thing. I don't know whether your schools have participated in that, had speakers in, or you've been speaking, or...
So I was at Ardsley High School a few weeks ago to educate and inform the students there about the dangers. But I created this video called Juulers Against Juul, in which I teamed up with 4 of my friends who are actually addicted to the Juul, and I interviewed them on their experiences with it, stories with it, and then kind of a cautionary tale to maybe a 6th grader who hasn't started, maybe thinking about starting. So I put it up on YouTube, but also shared it with my principal and my health teachers and other schools around me as kind of like a educational instrument in a way. So I think
great.
that's like a more...
Is that the one that they showed on Good Morning America?
Yeah.
Yes.
That's it.
That's great. So you
Thank
really, you were able to talk to a whole lot of people that way.
Yeah.
So it's up on YouTube. If people want to
Yes.
look for it, how do they locate it?
They just go to YouTube and search up Juulers Against Juul. Juulers as in Juul. So
Okay.
check
All
it
right.
out.
Yeah, that sounds great. So what about all these stores? I've been in some communities that, are really, I think somebody mentioned this about the vaping stores and whatever that sell all this within communities. And I know there have been a number of communities that don't want them, but I think you might have mentioned in Pleasantville. I don't
Yeah,
know. But
there's...
So I think that the communities have to probably pass legislation earlier on maybe to prevent them from happening, but does that really matter in this whole thing? Everybody can get cigarettes.
Let's ask them. Do you think any of your friends have any trouble getting vapes, whether or not the store is in your town or not in your town?
So there's no stores in my town currently, and kids have no trouble at all getting Juul pods, whether they're using fake IDs, the stores don't card the kids, or older people are buying it for them and reselling it. It's very accessible, and you could get it in the same day. You could text somebody and get it.
And again, there's an argument that if you're legislating these shops out, that you're preventing adults who would be using those products to decrease their cigarette use. So it's very hard to just look at it from one perspective, although for me it's very easy to look at it from the youth perspective. To me, there is no reason any young person should ever be vaping anything. They should only be inhaling one thing, which is air. Anything else they should not be breathing in. And so for me, that's why I like to talk about it with the youth, because it's an easy argument. They just should not be doing it.
Right. Otherwise, they come and see you later on, right?
Well, that's the problem. That's how I got into the
problem.
smoking cessation business, because it hurts to give someone a diagnosis of lung cancer or emphysema or talk to them about being on a ventilator for the rest of their life. And I do it much more frequently than I wish to. And it's painful, obviously, to receive that information, but from a career of doing it, I figure it's much better if I try and get ahead of it and be preventative. And so my concern with what's happening with the kids now is that there's this very cool device that is exactly timed perfectly for this generation of youth that has the most addictive substance known to mankind in it, at a time in their brain development where they're most likely to become addicts. And there's extremely good evidence that it leads to conventional cigarette use. So if you want to have a conversation about whether or not vaping or Juuls are dangerous at all, we won't know for 20 years. But if you want to have a conversation about whether or not there's going to be ramifications later on, if 2 to 7 times more likely, if 50% of our youth are Juuling right now, and only a small sliver of those kids go on to smoking conventional cigarettes later on,
still a
we're going to
lot.
have a tsunami of disease, COPD, lung cancer, heart attacks, diabetes. It's going to be horrible 20 to 30 years from now. And that's what I'm worried about.
Right. So where do we go with lobbying, get laws changed? What do we need? What are you all doing besides going to college next year? What are you advocating for?
Well, I was up in Albany last week, and I was focusing on obviously educating legislators about what's happening, but also kind of pushing for a regulation of the flavors, because I think it's common sense, obviously adults who are trying to use e-cigarettes to get off smoking are not using cotton candy or bubble gum, but the kids are, and I think that's a reasonable first step. And it's one of those pieces of legislation that will be easy to enforce, because you just can't sell it. So it's not just like, oh, I'll just smoke it in the bathroom. It's just clearly set out, and it will have a lot of impact, because clear as day, it can't be sold. So I just think that will be a great measure. But
And for me, I think that education is very important. I think that with the laws, you also need to educate the youth, because once that they understand that it's not good for them and it really gets through to them, it becomes a little bit less appealing. And I think that there's a very big disconnect about how bad Juul is in the youth's mind, because I think that they say, oh, nothing's really been shown on a mass scale that it's bad for you. And I think that that part is making kids say, oh, it's not bad for me, I'm going to do it anyway. And I think that if we start educating, it's a lot easier for those kids to not get hooked because they know that it's bad for them.
Yeah, no, that's really true. And you're fighting the cigarette companies, right? For the e-cigarette companies, which I guess are pretty much the same, aren't they? Are they the same? A little different?
No, the tobacco industry is catching up to the e-cigarette. The e-cigarette industry is really kind of the forefront, and right now, believe it or not, a lot of it is mom and pop shops that are around, and the major player that isn't is Juul, with a couple of competitors that aren't so as popular here in Westchester but are around. Juul is a startup venture capitalist out of San Francisco, and Big Tobacco, in their attempts to try and play catch up, are doing a lot of efforts in lobbying and legislation to make sure that this moves forward. Because if they're in the nicotine addiction industry, and this is just another way to continue nicotine addiction, then they want in. So more adult level kind of vaping, so something like Blue, which looks like a cigarette except for the tip is blue instead of red, has had some actors supporting it and being in advertisements.
Right.
And
I think we're going to probably have to stop at that point, but we have a lot of work to do as we go forward. And I just commend you all very much for all that you've been doing to make a difference in a lot of people's lives. And I just like to thank you all for being here, and thanks for watching. If you have any questions at all, just give me a call at my office, 914-941-1111. Thank you so much, and be a part of making these major changes. Thank you.